Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
I would love a chance to meet you in person. I'm out speaking on the road. I'm at the We Can Reason conference. That's going to be in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, first weekend in May. I'm in Denver at the Secular Hub. That's going to be the weekend of May the 26th. I'm going to be in Rochester, New York on the 12th of August. They're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Robert Greene Ingersoll Memorial Museum. And so they've asked me to come and kind of be the keynote. And that's a huge honor. And you're welcome to join us August 12th. And then August the 25th weekend, I'll be in Sarnia, Ontario. Anyway, forgive me for throwing all this out, but I figured if you were near any of those locations, you could sort of latch on and then go to the website. You can see my events page, sethandrews.com/events. So I was at the Florida Free Thought Conference in Orlando. My buddy Noah Lugeons speaking from the stage. I know I just put him on camera last year, and I thought, well, probably going to wait a while, break things up before I have him back. And then he does a speech about Christian video games. And I thought, damn it, now I have to have him back on the broadcast. Noah, thanks for coming, brother. It's good to talk to you.
Yeah, always great to hang out with you, man.
All right. So for those who are just now maybe joining the show for the first time, new listeners who are wondering who you are, kind of lay it out for us. Introduce yourself, if you would.
Sure. I am the co-host of the Scathing Atheist podcast and God Awful Movies, among others. So me and my buddies break down Christian. We break down the theology news and Christian news on the Scathing Atheist, and we watch Christian movies and make fun of them. And make fun of them. That's a fair way to say it. Over on God Awful Movies. So I experience traumatically terrible Christian media for a living.
How many God's Not Dead movies are there now? 5?
I think we're at 4.
4, something like that.
It could be at 5. They all sort of bleed together for me at a certain point, but I think we just did the 4th.
What's Kevin Sorbo been up to? I know he's been tweeting more and more politically. What's going? You been following Kevin?
Oh, yeah. No, I love following Kevin because it's just this slow motion train wreck that we've been watching for a decade and a half. So he was just in the most recent Left Behind movie, which I haven't watched yet, but I'm very much looking forward to. I believe this is the 6th time that novel series has made it to the theaters. And he's also if you follow him on social media, he's also begging people to pay him to send birthday greetings to their mother on Cameo and stuff. It's just so sad and delicious. Because don't get me wrong, I don't take joy in the failure of other people's unless they're Kevin Sorbo, right? Because there's just so much Schadenfreude there.
Yeah. Well, by the way, Left Behind, for those who aren't familiar, it's a Tim LaHaye book that came out in 1995. It's a novel, one of those sort of exciting novels that's supposed to be more exciting because it's rooted in biblical truth, dealing with the end times. Wasn't Kirk Cameron in a Left Behind film? Then I think Nick Cage.
Yeah, so there was a trilogy that they made shortly after the books came out, because eventually there were 12 of these books. I think while that series was still coming out, they made a trilogy with Kirk Cameron. He had to take the back seat in the third one because they got Mr. T, and they're like, well, if we got Mr. T, we don't need some little nobody like Kirk Cameron. But then they tried to reboot it with Nick Cage, and apparently they found the one thing Nick Cage wouldn't do, which was a sequel to that movie. So they made what they're calling a sequel to that film, although it shares no common actors or characters with that film, as near as I can tell, this one with Kevin Sorbo helming it.
There is also, and this brings me back, and we're going to pinball around because that's just how we roll, but there's a Left Behind video game. Left Behind Eternal Forces. It released in November of 2006, based on the books. Tell me you have seen and or played this game, Noah.
Okay, so yeah, I haven't actually played most of the Christian video games that I talked about in my talk, but I am familiar with this. This was actually the first of a trilogy of games, and it's mostly remembered for the backlash amongst Christians when it came out. It was pulled from store shelves shortly after it came out because, A, it was deemed too violent for a Christian game, but also because it was incredibly racist. There was a The plot of the game is that you're trying to turn all of the non-Christians Christian or kill them. That's the game. The game's manufacturer would argue with my assessment, but they're wrong. That's literally what the game is. It's a real-time strategy game based on those Left Behind series where, this is all post-rapture and you're just trying to Christianize as many people as you can before Jesus shows up.
Well, what's the motivation are we demons? So we're no longer human? We have to be wiped out like we've been co-opted by the devil, or?
Yeah, the Antichrist I can almost remember his name from the books. He has created all of these anti-Christian secular groups that you have to either Christianize or they'll attack you and you have to kill them.
Oh, I've got his name. Antichrist Nikolai Carpathia.
Carpathian, that's it. Yeah.
It's a single player game. You control the Tribulation Force. This is a Christian group in the post-rapture apocalypse, New York City, and you are combating the influence of the global community peacekeepers. And this is a play on the one world government, which has been part of the end times fear mongering since I can remember. It's strange, Noah, that so much fear is wrapped around the idea that human beings would cross borders to help humanity, to bond together, to find the things that unite us instead of dividing us. The whole idea of allies and community and humanity is threatening to these people.
Right. Yeah. This religion that sells itself as a religion of universal love, right? That's supposed to be the entire point, is to love everyone and to work together with everyone. But as soon as you suggest actually doing that, yeah, they make video games about how terrifying it would be.
Let's talk about the early days. I am talking, by the way, to one of the most impressive gamers. Like, you run decades of game knowledge. You have consoles. What's the oldest gaming console you own at the moment?
The oldest gaming console I own is the oldest gaming console that there is. The very first game console that was ever released was the Magnavox Odyssey in 1973, and it is so profoundly basic. All you can really do with it, all they could do is draw a couple of dots on the screen and move them around. So in lieu of graphics, you have these little clings that would like static cling to your television that would give you the mazes that you're trying to make your way through and things like that. It's just impossibly basic stuff. I have been trying to collect, because when you bought it, it came with fake money and it came with all kinds of other stuff. And I've been trying for quite a while to get all of the different accessories that came with it. But I have a working version of the console itself.
I was weaned on Pong. Do you have a Pong machine?
I do. I have the original Atari Pong. I still have to get the Sears version of it. But yeah.
How do you play this? Do you have to have an old TV with a little TV computer switcher? How do you play this stuff in the year 2023? Yeah,
so at the risk of sounding like one of those guys that says you have to listen to it on vinyl, you kind of have to play these games on cathode ray tube televisions, and not just because it's really hard to connect them to modern TVs. They put out so little input that, a modern TV will just give you a blue screen. They'll be like, that must be static. There can't possibly be an entire image's worth in there. Now you can buy things that'll step that up a little bit, and you can connect them to modern TVs. But when you do, you lose a lot because the programmers used the limitations of the CRT in lieu of graphics from time to time. not to get too nerdy, but like if you put two lines really close together on a cathode ray tube television, it just comes out as a blur. So they would do that for like tires in a moving vehicle to make them look like they're blurred and moving. And of course, if you play that on a modern TV, it's just lines that are close together and it looks weird.
I was an Atari 2600 guy. I was kind of a snob about the Intellivision because I had a ColecoVision. Remember Donkey Kong on ColecoVision? I mean, legendary. It was incomparable to the other stuff that was out there. Yeah. Well, the ColecoVision was really kind of a generation ahead of its competitors. It was graphically, it was about as good as the Nintendo Entertainment System that would sort of dominate the market after it was gone. It just didn't have the capacity to play that big of games, but graphically it was almost indistinguishable. So if I'm hearing you right, you go old school. You would much rather go and crank out the old tube television with the switcher than play an emulator.
Oh yeah, absolutely. For me, a lot of it is about the actual feel of the old controllers, the actual feel of, do you remember the switches on the Atari 2600, those little silly, like, black and white switch or the difficulty switches and stuff? There's something about that little tactile movement of changing those switches that really brings me back to, playing video games as a 7-year-old and 8-year-old.
No, we used to do the stuff that you're never supposed to do, like blow on the game cartridge when it's not working correctly. That was always fun. Let's just throw a bunch of moisture.
Why don't we spit on these electronics and see if that helps? Yeah.
So as we, are back in the heyday of, I'll call it the heyday. Obviously, every age has got its amazing. I love video gaming technology today. I am not at all a snob about this stuff, but there's a charm to the late 70s, early 80s, the genesis of all of this. I've been watching a lot of these documentaries about the rise and fall of Atari. Is it true that E.T. was responsible or largely responsible for the death of the Atari company?
I think that's a bit of a simplistic view. It's a real popular one, but no, E.T. was huge. That was a big thing for that company specifically. But what happened is that they lost control of third-party software. And it got to the point where any company that wanted to could make an Atari game and put it out on the market. The retailers didn't know the difference between an Activision game and a Fly-by-Night Industries game. And so it got to the point where the market was just flooded with terrible games. Now, the fact that Atari came out with, first of all, the worst possible version of Pac-Man that you can imagine. If you recall Atari's Pac-Man, it was so bad. And then immediately after that, their next big release was E.T., which was famously, it was programmed in like a week and a half. I guess it wasn't quite that extreme, but Howard Scott Warshaw, the guy who programmed it, was given an incredibly truncated amount of time to program it to the point where he had to like have a computer installed in his home, like the kind of computer they used at Atari HQ, so that he could just roll out of bed and start working on it without showering or shaving the entire time. So, and it's just an absolutely terrible game. It's almost unplayable. So the fact that Atari had those two big misses back to back certainly hurt. But I think it was the glut of terrible third-party games and the fact that there were, a dozen different game consoles that were competing with it at that point. I think that had more to do with it than anything else.
I'm going to resist the temptation to just talk. I mean, you and I could just throw out Defender, right? I think I threw out Yar's Revenge the other day online and everybody's like, here's an emulator, go play it. We could do that all day, but I guess we need to talk about Christian video games. What are we talking about? Early 1980s? Did they wait until the market had become more saturated? I mean, tell me about for lack of a better way of saying it, the genesis of the Christian video game.
Well, so there's a big caveat that you have to put on this because there's a kind of a black hole in the history of early PC video games. Much of what was sold at that time was being programmed by just some dude in his spare room. And, they'd take it to the computer store and he would have it like wrapped himself in a little envelope or whatever and sell that. So when it comes to the very first Christian video games ever made, ever sold, we probably don't know what they are. They were probably programmed by small companies that no longer exist. They were sold in just regionally. And this probably would have happened 79, 80, 81. The earliest we know of is in 1982. There's a company that I believe still exists called Bible Bytes. It does, though. If you've read it, it kind of does. But they released a series of games in 1982 for the TRS-80, the old trash 80, which was the computer that you could get at the Radio Shack back in the day. That came out in 1977,
I see one list
I think.
for the TRS-80. I actually pulled this up. 1982 Bible Scramble games. There's memory verse games. Noah's Ark, Heavenly Mansions. There's one called Moses's Rod.
Whoops.
The Rapture game. Are these just ripoffs of what was popular in the culture? Because we know that's what Christianity does. They find what the zeitgeist is doing, and they're like, oh, God, we've got to make a Christian version of that. Is that your impression?
Yeah, that's, these are incredibly basic games. These games were programmed in TRS-80 basic, right? They weren't even machine language programmed. So you're talking about incredibly basic stuff. Most of it they were essentially word games with Christian words. There were a few graphical games, and then the Noah's Ark game was graphical. I believe Moses' Rod was. But they were the most simplistic possible things. And yes, there was nothing original with any of those games. And in fact, I don't know that there's anything original in any Christian game at any point in history. So
the TRS-80, was that 5 1/4 floppy, or was that a tape drive?
That was a tape drive. Yeah.
Cassette tape. You'd sit there for like 45 minutes listening to it, hoping there wasn't a crimp in the tape or some flaw that made the upload completely impossible. Right.
Yeah, we're going pre-floppy disk days there, yeah.
So what happens after 1982? Do we see an evolution of the games? It's a loaded question. I know the answer. It's not really an evolution, but that's the only word I have.
Yeah, I know that the Christians would hate you using that word to describe their thing. But so like we already mentioned, sort of that glut of terrible third-party games for the Atari. There were a couple of Christian games in that glut. They both came out in 1983. You had The Music Machine, which was just one of these games. And there were 100 games like this. And there still are, I guess. This very simplistic game where you just move along the bottom of a screen back and forth, and you have to catch some things and avoid other things. According to the instructions in Music Machine, you were catching the fruit of the Holy Spirit. I guess that's what made it Christian. The other was this. I hesitate to even call it a Pitfall ripoff, because that's an insult to Pitfall there. But there was a game called Red Sea Crossing that was also available for the Atari, and it was the sort of the early platformer type thing. It was a very short game with almost nothing to it. But
Atari weren't they pretty proprietary? Are these Christian games being made off the grid, unauthorized?
Well, so there was actually, they were so early. The Atari 2600 came out, what was that, 1977, 78, something like that. Nobody had even considered the possibility of third-party software at that point. They never, they assumed that the only people that were ever going to make games for the Atari was Atari. They had a couple of programmers break away early on because they said, well, we're getting paid dick for the amount of work we're doing, for the amount of money we're bringing in. We should just start our own company. These were the guys that started the company Activision. And when they did, Atari sued them, and they said, well, you can't release games for our system. The courts disagreed. And so there was a period of a couple of years before the big video game crash in 83 where anybody who wanted to release an Atari game could. There was no authorization.
Are we talking mostly about just swapping out? Like, in this version of the game, you're fighting, a lizard or a dragon, and the Christian company just takes the same code and switches it out with, the devil and one of his minions kind of thing?
Exactly. Yeah, that's 99% of what you see up until the mid 2000s. In the Christian video game world. Sometimes it's literally that, right? Like there's a company called Wisdom Tree Games that actually took the game engine for Castle Wolfenstein 3D. They just changed the graphics out to make it Noah's Ark themed. And they officially licensed it from id Software and everything. And they're like, we're going to make a Christian version of that.
Hang on, Noah. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. id gave them permission to use the game engine?
Yeah. Yeah, because so this was right after Doom came out. This company comes along. They say, we want to make a Christian version of it. The folks at id were like, well, we can't make any money off of this engine anyway. We just antiquated it with Doom. So they said, sure. And so they licensed it to this company that then went ahead and put it out as an unauthorized game on the Super Nintendo. It is, if I'm not mistaken, the only unauthorized game that was ever released in the U.S. for the Super Nintendo. It was called Super Noah's Ark 3D.
So did it look like an Ark? Or did it look like Wolfenstein 3D?
It looked like Wolfenstein 3D with like wood instead of stone on the walls. It was the funniest bit to me so there's in Castle Wolfenstein, when you get later on, of course, there's pictures of Hitler everywhere, right? Because you're battling Nazis, and they had to put pictures of something. So they just have this identical picture of Noah everywhere. Like Noah had gone around and hung selfies all over the ark in case the animals forgot who was in charge or something.
Talking here with Noah Lugeons. He is host of Scathing Atheist, one of the hosts of God Awful Movies, and if I may, a gaming god. I don't want to put the cart before the horse here, but is there any one religious video game you played that was any good?
So it depends on how you define religious video game, right? Because if you're talking about games that are based in Christian mythology, I've played a lot of them that are good, right? The
like you can say Diablo series with the devil.
Sure. But when you're talking about, like what I'm talking about when I say Christian video games, are these games that are actually designed to make you Christian, designed to share the gospel or to teach people about the Bible or whatever. And if that's the standard you're using, no, there was a Noah's Ark game that Konami came out with that I could see like having some fun with. That's as close as I could come to endorsing any of them.
So am I Moses in some of these games? You know, am I being healed by Jesus? I mean, what kind of characters in your experience are we playing?
Well, more often than anything, you're Noah, right? They love to use Noah. There have been so many video games based on Noah, but you can be there are games where you play Moses. That's the Red Sea crossing. You play Moses. There's one that, again, Wisdom Tree Games came out with that just cracks me up. That's based on Moses, where you play Moses' mother and you're trying to sneak him past all of the Pharaoh's men and float him up the river or whatever. And I love this specifically because you carry him around like the vegetables in Super Mario Brothers 2. And occasionally you have to literally throw the baby past different obstacles. That's a hell of an image. You know, throwing a baby is never a great look for anybody, but throwing the baby Moses, a little worse. There are, of course, also some games where you play Jesus Christ himself. So, you know, you can role play anybody you want in the Bible, I guess.
I want to come back to that because there's one in development and there's a story on it. Give me another. I mean, I don't want to say greatest hits because they're so awful, but they're so awful. Maybe they are great. Some of the highlights that you've seen and or played.
There's two actually that just, I think, stand out above all the rest. One of them is called Sunday Fun Day. And it's not an exceptional game in any way. It's just funny what it's based on. We were talking about reskinning old games to Christianize them. This company, Wisdom Tree Games, that I've talked about a couple of times now, they started their life as a different regular software company, and they just saw this hole in the market for Christian games. So they started reskinning all of their old games and making Christian versions of them. And one of them was this game that was just notorious. It was a bit controversial because the whole idea of the game is that you were skateboarding around town fighting this gang in an effort to rescue your girlfriend quick before all her clothes rotted off. Sexism in video games, real thing. But at any rate, and so in between levels, you'd see your girlfriend and she'd be like progressively nakeder every time. That way, I guess that was your reward for getting through the level. So they took that exact game, they took the girlfriend out, they put a Sunday school teacher in, and they made it so that the plot of the game was you're trying to get to Sunday school on time. But they kept the idea that this gang is trying to stop you. So who the fuck is this gang? Are these just atheists? A bunch of atheists that don't want, like, this is the devil's team that doesn't want. There's a part in this game where you fight a bear. There's a bear trying to keep you from getting to Sunday school. It just demands a little more fleshing out in terms of the plot.
You say there was a second one as well?
Yeah, and it's my favorite thing ever. It's a game called Captain Bible in Dome of Darkness. So this is a game where, no shit, you have to try to save a city by killing aliens with Bible verses.
Is there a tree? Wait, is there a verse tree and you have to choose which one is going to like wield the most points or the most damage?
Exactly. That's exactly it. So you have you run around town and you find these little computer terminals where you can download individual Bible passages. And then whenever you come across a bad guy, he'll say something that is a Bible lie. That's actually how they phrase it in the game. He'll tell you a Bible lie, and then you've got to go through all your verses and figure out which one refutes the lie. Right. So the alien might tell you, well, God would never love something as pathetic as you. And then you've got to go and find the verse that says God loves all his creatures, great and small. And of course, this is an effort to familiarize you with Bible verses, which is always the downfall of the Christian game, right? That they also have to like be Christian and do a Christian thing. And that's always incredibly boring. But once you find the correct Bible verse, there's a great little death animation that you'll see for the alien. And then you get to move on, with that part of the city saved.
These games make money. I mean, is there profit behind this stuff?
Some of them make a little money, but they don't have to. That's the real key to this thing, right? Because for a long time, this was the case in the Christian movie industry. It's not necessarily about what you make in the box office. It's about how easy it is to talk someone into producing it. If you're a director or a writer, or whatever, you want to make Christian movies, all you've got to do is talk some church group or some Christian philanthropist into funding your movie. And you've got a year's worth of income and maybe this one hits, maybe it doesn't matter. Right. And Christian video games are very much the same way. That, like, as long as I can convince you, and the development time, of course, on a video game is far longer than the development time on a movie. So you can say, like, look, once I've convinced this Christian group to finance this video game, me and all my buddies have jobs for the next 2 years. And so what if they lose money?
Got to wonder if that's a tax advantage, too. I mean, if you call it a ministry, maybe you could make a tithe or donation for the cause of spreading the gospel through media kind of thing. I don't know.
I'm sure that you can. I mean, given how easy it is to declare things ministries at this point. And look, this was, we talked earlier about the Left Behind game. They made 3 games out of that series. The first one lost a ton of money. The first one lost literally millions of dollars, and they still made sequels to it. And that was back in like 2006. Now they're funding these things through Kickstarter. So it's no longer, you don't have to find somebody with several $1 million they're willing to invest. You just have to find several thousand people with $25 to invest.
Kickstarter brings us to supposedly the upcoming Jesus video game. What's it called?
It is called I Am Jesus Christ, and it has been perpetually right around the corner now for 3 damn years.
I saw the trailer for it on YouTube. I Am Jesus Christ, and of course, it's the most bland, ethereal thing. Just, and you're floating around. I guess you're doing miracles, and it's like coming soon, but it just never arrives. Tell me about the game, Noah.
Yeah, so there's a playable version of what they say is the first third of it on Steam, right? And so you run around, you get baptized by John the Baptist, you turn water into wine, you fight Satan at a certain point in the game. And this is a fairly common way that independent studios will get their games published, right? They'll publish the first third of it, they'll put that out, for free or for a very low price on Steam and say, hey, if you like this, then here's our Kickstarter where we're going to do the other 2/3 of the game, or we're going to create the DLCs for this game. But with I Am Jesus Christ, the release has been delayed over and over and over again to the point where you really start having to question whether they have any intent in making the other 2/3 of the game at all. But even if they do, ultimately, it's it's a first-person Messiah simulator. Not a lot of fun to be had in being virtually crucified in the first person.
You're not going to be crucified in the game.
I feel like you have to be crucified. They're telling the story of Jesus. Now, none of that shows up in the preview because the preview only shows things from the first third of the game. But I have to imagine, there's going to be a first-person crucifixion in there.
You're born, you're giving the Sermon on the Mount, you're healing the leper, you're raising Lazarus, and then shit goes down, and you end up becoming a meat pinata in the middle of a video game. I mean, I would play that. I would stream that just for the hell of it.
Oh, I think they're going to release it in VR, too. They keep saying they're going to put it in VR. That'd be great.
You could be Jesus in the virtual world.
I wonder if in the crucifixion level, you'll have to hold your hands up the whole time, or if there'll be a penalty for that.
I guess you'll be lying in the tomb, and there's a time lapse, so you don't have to wait for Sunday for you to rise again, kind of thing. I don't know. Okay, we can't have Noah Lugeons on the show without talking about god-awful movies, Christian films. Why do they keep making them? And how bad do they get? We're going to talk more next. If you want to support your humble host and help me do what I do, become a patron You get the show 2 days early, and you get it totally commercial-free. Patreon.com/Seth Andrews. I'm talking here with Noah Lugeons. He is host of the Scathing Atheist podcast and one of the hosts of God Awful Movies. Beyond the video game phenomenon that Christians do so poorly, you have seen firsthand the other media that Christians do so poorly. I came out of contemporary Christian music. There's a story, right? Mm-hmm. They'd wait for something to hit on pop or rock radio and go, oh, we need a Christian version of that. And they would release something that was alarmingly, disturbingly poor. And video games have done the same thing. Can we talk about movies, since that's really maybe the lion's share of what you've been doing recently? Give me some of the highlights of the Christian films you've had to endure.
Well, yeah, so we've been scraping the bottom of the barrel since the very beginning of that, because let's face it, there's no top of the barrel when it comes to Christian movies. But yeah, a lot of what we're doing now is from a website called the christiancinema.com, which is basically the too hot for pure flicks source for Christian movies. And what I love about these ones is, so you have Pure Flix, which is, I can't remember who owns it, but one of the major Hollywood studios at this point owns that. All of the big, Affirm films and stuff, all of those are owned by Sony and Warner Brothers and the conglomerates that own all of entertainment at this point. And so what is actually being said in those movies has been dialed back quite a bit in the decade or so, or near decade, that we've been doing god-awful movies. So now what you have to do is you have to look for the things that are hidden behind these various paywalls in places like christiancinema.com to find the truly homophobic and disturbing stuff that Christian kids are actually seeing. So yeah, we've been having a lot of fun with some of the lesser known Christian filmmakers like Chip Rossetti and Donald James Parker. These are names that I think only extreme Christian movie cinephiles and listeners of our show would know.
So the big corporations have come in. They did the same thing with Christian music. We had these boutiques, sort of mom and pop record labels. Everything was sort of recorded on a shoestring. And then once it started to show a profit, the majors came in, Sony, Columbia, EMI, et cetera. They bought up these boutique labels, and then everything became homogenized, right? The lyrics got softer and the artists got prettier. And you're saying the same thing has happened with movies. They've come in and just sort of decided, well, let's not say or do anything that's too polarizing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you look at Affirm Films is a great example. This was started by the guys, their names slipped my mind at the moment, but they made the movie Fireproof with Kirk Cameron, which was one of these absolute shoestring budget type of things. It was filmed just down the road from me in Albany, Georgia. And it made a ton of money. I don't remember the exact amount, but when you look at the budget that it had and the money that it made back, it's just staggering. So when God's Not Dead hit, Sony bought up that company, and it went from these movies with, the kind of disturbing content that like you probably remember from your church days to that much more generic, Hallmark friendly, forward facing version of Christianity that's not going to offend Joel Osteen's parishioners. And that company was bought up by Sony and is now the most profitable Christian film company of all time.
Yeah, they made the first God's Not Dead for like $1 million. I think it grossed 60. And I thought to myself, well, I mean, even if you didn't believe, you just believed in capitalism or profit. I mean, that sounds like a no-brainer to me. By the way, Fireproof, I actually sat through that one. Kirk Cameron, he's this dude who's like got porn and he's clearing his browser history, and his marriage is falling apart as he's over here, lusting and being carnal. And they end up going through some epiphany, and he comes back to Jesus, and their marriage is now fireproof. It's protected from the fires of evil, I guess. I mean,
yes.
Vacuous, calorie-free look at relationships that, in recent memory. Have you been following Mel Gibson? He's filming The Passion of the Christ Part 2.
Yes, I'm so excited. I never thought we'd get a chance to see it, but here it comes. Yeah, I kind of hope that Jesus goes John Wick in this one, right? That he goes back and busts the hell out all of those Romans that crucified him. I don't think that's how he's going to go with it, though.
I used to be the biggest Mel Gibson fan, right? I mean, he's the Road Warrior, just a perfect film. It's just one of those zeitgeist moments in my youth. I'm one of those guys that, despite the fact it was history free and fact free, Braveheart. All right, fine. I'll take the journey.
Good.
I'll take the Braveheart journey. And then he just turns in. We realize that he's just awful. Domestic abuse and racism against the Jews, Holocaust denier, and then he has all these opportunities to come forward and apologize and say, you know what, I was wrong, and I'm sorry for the hurt that I caused, and I'm going to be better and do better. And I'm all about second chances. Right now, I'm thinking I love redemption stories, and every time that door's open and he's given the chance to come out and be better and do the right thing and say the words of healing, he doubles down and says something that's awkward and uncomfortable. When the Passion of the Christ, the first one came out, churches had him on stage. He actually did church tours. Pastors were hugging him and they were talking about, they took tours. Churches would actually schedule field trips. They would bus the congregants to the theaters. Some would hold altar calls at the end of the film. And then, all the headlines about him getting pulled over, drunk off his ass, screaming about the Jews, etc. I think that's going to be a hell of a lot harder for the Passion of the Christ Resurrection. I'm curious to see what the church's response to Mel is for part 2.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too, because at the same time that he has been failing to make these apologies, I think that anti-Semitism has gotten a lot more popular in Christian circles. And I think that their tolerance for bigotry in the post-Trump world is far higher. So I wonder if he hasn't just waited for society to come around to his drunken rants a little more.
Are these evangelical tools, in your opinion, or do you think they're preaching to the choir? They just cash it in for a built-in audience they know already exists?
Well, I think that you have a mixture of both. I think that there are definitely the majority of it is just preaching to the choir. That's certainly what all the God's Not Dead movies are doing, right? The whole idea of the first God's Not Dead movie is, well, you could probably argue with one of them fancy science professors about God and win, couldn't you? God, it's not unreasonable to believe in that. And that's all it's willing to say. So there's nothing there in terms of apologetics. But there are definitely movies like The Shack, which came out a few years ago with the dude from Avatar and nothing else. There's a movie called Miracles from Heaven with Jennifer Garner that, really presented sort of but be the miracle in someone else's life, kind of a vision of what the miraculous was. And so there are definitely movies like that are trying to reach out to the nominally Christian or the spiritual, but not religious and go, see, Christianity might fit. There's a certain amount of that, but by and large, I think it is just trying to cash in on sort of a captive audience that's not allowed to watch something that has boobs in it.
And an audience that is desperate to play victim. Was it God's Not Dead 2, where Melissa Joan Hart was put on trial because Christianity was made illegal? Am I remembering that right, Noah?
So it's even sillier than that. At some point, someone asked her whenever she was a school teacher, and somebody said, well, I don't know of any historical example of this happening. And she's like, well, there was this example and Jesus Christ and this example. And then, of course, the school fired her for saying the name of Jesus Christ and for teaching kids about Christianity. And so she had to go on trial for mentioning Jesus. On trial in a courtroom. And as I recall, they didn't really nail anything down. There were no specific charges. Nope.
She was just there. They just brought her in.
And they spent the entire trial just having random apologetics. They just bring in apologists and go, well, it turns out that there's actually quite a bit of historical evidence for Jesus Christ's existence. I was just like, what the hell does this have to do with anything?
Like the films just find an opening to throw a sermon in. Remember the old, we did that as a show, the old Estes Perkle movie, where there was a horrible scenario going on involving abuse and murder of children, etc. And then they would just cut away to him behind the pulpit and he would preach for 10 minutes at a time.
Yeah, the whole movie was essentially just his sermon with, hyper violent acting out here and there.
Talking here with Noah Lugeons, who is one of the hosts of God Awful Movies. Introduce this audience, those who aren't familiar, with David A.R. White. I'm just going to throw it out. Take it where you want.
So David A.R. White is one of the most he's probably the guy who's been on the most God-awful movies episodes. This guy, he got his start as a child actor in television. I believe he was on the show Evening Shade. He had a minor character there, if you remember that one, with, I think, was that
Burt Reynolds?
Yeah. So he had a minor role there, and very early on, he got picked up to do some Christian movies. realized his career was going nowhere and decided that he was going to be a Christian action hero and a Christian comic icon and a Christian romance icon and also everything else. So he started making these movies where he cast himself into every imaginable role. And eventually one of the movies he made was God's Not Dead, right? So eventually after his, 15th movie, he actually made a profit on one of them and became incredibly wealthy. He started PureFlix, which is, in addition to a movie studio, it's also a streaming service. It's the largest Christian streaming service. And he's just, of course, the heyday of God's Not Dead, there's a lot more competition now, and his movies don't make anywhere near as much money. I believe God's Not Dead 4 was released in theaters for 2 days, a Tuesday and a Wednesday. So not quite the boon that he got with the $60 million opening for the original. But he continues to plug away at it, and like all of the major Christian filmmakers outside of, like I said, Sony just trying to cash in on and make the least offensive Christian movie possible, he's just got a long series of terrible messages undergirding his movies. And that's why we do what we do, right? Like, making fun of him is fun and everything, but someone in the atheist movie needs to watch these movies and see what they're saying. It's not just God is real. David A.R. White's movies have serious anti-psychiatry messages to them. Obviously, there's a lot of misogyny and anti-reproductive rights in them. God's Not Dead 4 was all about homeschooling and the importance of defunding public schools. So really presaged a lot of the stuff that we're seeing out of Republican politics now. So yeah, of all the filmmakers that we've watched, like, I don't want to solve things with violence, but if you made me smack one of them and ask me which one to choose, I think David A.R. White might be my guy.
I didn't know he started PureFlix. That's a revelation to me.
Yeah, it was him and I think 2 other producers, but he was the driving force behind it. Yeah.
Do you ever get those ads? Like, I see PureFlix ads on some of my YouTube content, and my first blush was to go and try to find the Google block page for the ad, and then I stopped. I thought, well, he's not going to convince anybody in this one. Like, he's waiting. Like, thanks for the money, David.
And not only that, but thanks for that, being here instead of on some video where it might convince somebody to use your product. Yeah.
Does David A.R. White have any idea you exist? Are you on his radar or the PureFlix radar or whatever?
I don't know for sure. I shouldn't say this, but the director of several of his films has reached out to us. He's an atheist. He's listened to our reviews and he's aware of us. And
I'm sorry. Hang on. I know I interrupted the flow of your thought, but I can't stand it. The director of, did you say the God's Not Dead film is an atheist?
No, it's I can't say too much about this because he's asked us not to go public with it, but he's.
Okay. Well, I can slice this out. If this is a problem. Okay.
Yeah, no, I can't say specifically which of David A.R. White's movies he directed, but he directed more than one of them. And he is an atheist. He's a non-believer. He insists that, David A.R. White's a good guy, try to do a good thing. And I've actually had a good conversation with him where I'm like, yeah, but, you see the kind of poison he's putting out into the world. And this guy no longer works with David A.R. White, I should say. I should give him that credit as well. But we've had several of the filmmakers reach out to us here and there since we started doing God Awful movies. Generally, it's going to be the people who make the smaller films, but to my knowledge, I've never had any reason to believe that David A.R. White knows who we are. I think Kevin Sorbo does, though.
His timeline has become more and more desperate. Wasn't he blaming all of us for the fact that he couldn't get a job? Kevin Sorbo was like, no one will hire me, and it's the fault of those godless people. Wasn't that the shtick he was doing?
Yeah, right, because his career was going so great before God's Not Dead. Yeah.
Isn't this sort of genre the graveyard of a lot of once at least semi-popular actors? Do you find yourself having a flash of recognition? There's so-and-so from this sitcom in the 1980s kind of thing?
Well, it's almost always sitcoms from the 1980s. Yeah, a lot of those have been ruined for me. Harry Anderson from Night Court turned out to be a evangelical douchebag. Cliff Clavin from Cheers, John Ratzenberger. I always have to double check in my mind if I'm talking about him or the Pope, right? John Ratzenberger versus Ratzinger. Yeah. But he's in a ton of these Christian movies. Obviously, Kevin Sorbo, Corbin Burnson shows up in a lot of them. But it's not always, sometimes like actual legitimate actors, sort of muscle their way into this space just because of their religious feelings or the religious mission. I don't know if you're aware, but Marky Mark is now becoming a big player in the Christian movie world. Mark Wahlberg has said now that he will only ever make Christian movies from now on.
No way.
Yeah, we're talking about Oscar caliber actor here when he's not just phoning it in, which is most of the time. But yeah, he did that movie Father Stew. I think it was
Mel
last
Gibson.
year.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Mark Wahlberg is in a film that I just loved. I actually just bought it on Blu-ray, Deepwater Horizon, which is just a terrific action movie, and it's based on a real story. And so to see, I die inside a little bit, shit, there's someone else that I really like who's starting to promote things that are in contrast to my value system. It hurts.
I mean, you got to figure the Christians get it a lot worse, though. Think about all the great actors that have come out as secular or that have endorsed secular worldviews and stuff, and how often they must be hit by that. Oh, now I can't like that person, or at least now I can't hang out with them in heaven.
I won't keep you much longer, but I got to tell you this story. Back when I was in Christian radio in the 1990s, it was the time of what was called the Promise Keepers movement. And this was a movement targeted specifically to men. You need to be a godly man, put on the full armor of God. You are a soldier in God's army. You are to head the household. And they didn't use the word dominion, but the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. And so they would have these big rallies where the men would go out and they would learn how to be godly men to guide the home and guide their wives and children into holiness. It was a whole movement. I think it continues today. And so one year, they were having a big Promise Keepers rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they said, and our featured guest speaker this year will be Gary Busey. And I thought, okay, well, he's from Tulsa, and I guess he found Jesus at the time. I don't know where he is now. So it was my job to log on and get him on. I guess we had an ISDN feed, and for him to record the promo. And I haven't heard the word fuck that much since the last time I heard god-awful movies. I'm sitting in a Christian studio, and he would be trying to record the script, and he would mess up and go, fuck. And you could hear him pounding the table. And the Promise Keepers reps who were in the studio monitoring the session were just about to crawl into the woodwork like, oh, God, what have we gotten ourselves into? And, of course, Gary Busey is just priceless. Right. I mean, you've seen the interviews of that guy. He's just wild. I don't know what his story is, but sorry, I just took that digression. Any final thoughts about Christian video games or films or Gary Busey or whatever?
Well, no, I will tie Gary Busey back in. Actually, he was also in the third God's Not Dead movie where they pushed Kirk Cameron out of the limelight with Howie Mandel and Carrie Fisher and Mr. T. So that, honestly, that may have factored into it. They're like, oh, he was in a Christian movie. Let's have him on there. Look, when I set out to do this talk on Christian video games, I just wrote out on a list. I don't know how you build your talks, but I read out a list of these are all the points that I'd like to make. And then I sort of talk through them as though I'm doing it conversationally. And that's sort of the rough draft of my talk. So I got done with that. And the talk was about an hour and 25 minutes long. I was looking to fill 45 minutes, right? Yeah. So I had to take so much of the stuff out. And one of the things that I had to take out was the original conclusion that I had for the talk, which was to basically ask, why is it that Christians have been so anti-video game for so very long? And my theory on this is that it actually comes from the fact that increasingly video games are competition for religion. Video games, because they allow you to tell a story in the second person in a way that nothing else does, right? It's not, he did this. It's not I did this. It's you did this. You took the action that made this happen. And because of that, they can be genuine moral arbiters. They can be genuine moral tutors. Increasingly in games, you'll find yourself in a situation where you actually live out the trolley problem. You have to decide, do I save this person who's a good guy but useless in a fight, or do I have to save this bad person who helps me out a lot in the next battle, right? And religion doesn't like competition. At the same time, religion, they say that they can teach you to help you cope with loss. Well, so can a video game, believe it or not. I urge your listeners to look up the game That Dragon Cancer, which was a game that was made by an independent game studio that was all about the tragedy of having a child that's diagnosed with childhood cancer and doesn't make it to their 5th birthday. That's the whole game, is to help you try to get into the heads of those people. And it was people who had experienced that made that game and wanted to share their experience with others. So increasingly, as games get more sophisticated, they become better at teaching moral lessons and helping us cope with loss and feeling a sense of togetherness and feeling a sense of accomplishment and a sense of purpose. All those various things that religions count on to keep you coming back to the pews over and over again. And I think that more and more, that's the reason why Christians just, they hate, look, they don't hate music. They hate music that's of the world or whatever. They don't hate movies. They hate movies that are of the world, but they hate video games as a medium by and large, right? And I think that that's a lot of the reason why.
It's interesting. When I was growing up, they were like, why do you spend so much time playing video games? You'll never make a living at it. And of course, then I see today some 12-year-old on Twitch who was driven to his playground in a limousine because he's got 50
right.
squillion viewers. But it's interesting that people like to discount video games as a pastime. Meanwhile, they'll go play golf, right? Or they go and they do some other hobby. My wife likes to call it bubblegum for the brain. This whole idea of minimizing and marginalizing a very legitimate and what I consider to be amazing and healthy, even a community of people worldwide. I mean, you want to speak to the fact that people kind of poo-poo video games as, well, it's just for kids and it's a waste of time?
Yeah, I mean, as a person who collects old video game consoles and puts in a lot of effort into studying video game history, I encounter that a lot. People say, well, why are you spending so much time on a kid's thing? And I think, first of all, part of the reason why it's considered a kid's thing is because Christians freaked out every time we tried to put adult themes into video games and said, oh, kids are going to see that. And so they sort of drove it into that world. But consider this. Imagine that you're a historian 400 years from now, and you're trying to explain the reconciliation between Japan and the United States after World War II. And the speed with which we reconciled, the speed with which, people who grew up with this incredible propaganda to try to make us hate one another were able to, within a generation or two, learn to not just get along, but to actually genuinely love and absorb one another's culture, right? Americans my age and your age, we loved Japanese culture growing up, and Japanese kids our age loved American culture growing up. Imagine you're trying to explain that and you're not allowed to mention video games. You're not allowed to talk about our mutual love of video games and how much we shared back and forth in developing that new medium. There would be a huge hole in the story that you're trying to tell. Video games are as important, at least as culturally important to us now as opera was to 17th century Germany, or 18th century Germany rather, as visual arts were to Renaissance Italy. They're a form of entertainment that is shared as universally as anything has ever been shared. And yet people want to discount this as unimportant. Well, if art history is important, then video game history is important.
Last question for you. What are you playing now? What's on your radar? What's on your computer, television, whatever?
I just got a PSVR 2. So I'm a huge fan of VR gaming. So I've been playing the Horizon's Call of the Mountain on PSVR 2. Very incredibly immersive game.
Does VR, I mean, I get nauseous. I'm the most motion sick person on the planet. When I put on the headset, I literally want to retch. Is that a problem for you ever?
So it was a problem for me when I first started. You'll find that you get VR legs in a sense. I have a lot of problems with motion sickness. I can't read in a moving vehicle, for example. But I learned to do it by playing a little bit at a time and playing games that had very low or very high comfort ratings. There are games where you're more or less stationary, but then there are also games where you're riding around on a roller coaster. So it's something that you can learn over time. If you're,
I came down the stairs after I had the Oculus on and I'm all green and Natalie's like, what were you playing? And I'm like, poker.
Well, so it might just be that some people are hopeless. I don't know.
It's true. It's true. What else is on your radar? What else are you playing? Go ahead.
Well, mostly right now, I'm just counting down the days until the new Legend of Zelda game comes out. I honestly, I would put the last installment in that series, Breath of the Wild, at the very top of the greatest video games ever made. They've been teasing me with Tears of the Kingdom now for 2.5 years. That comes out in early May, I think. So that's I'm literally taking a week off of work to play that game when it comes out. So.
It must be done. Noah Lugeons. He is one of the hosts of God Awful Movies. You can find him at Scathing Atheist, a great podcast. Is that weekly? You come out once a week on that? Okay. It's funny because when we talked about Scathing Atheist, I think it's been a few years. I said, are you still scathing? And you said, well, I used to be scathing on my behalf, but now I'm scathing on as an advocate for other people. I scathe for other people as you go after religion, et cetera. You still do the rants on Scathing Atheist?
Yeah, open every week with what I call the diatribe, which is where I try to be angry on behalf of people who have nobody to yell to.
Okay, I'll put those links in the description box. Enjoyable as always, my friend. I will see you on the road. No illusions. Thanks again.
Thanks, man.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming Free Thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.